Here we are in the center of Paris, in front of Notre Dame Cathedral, a truly remarkable monument to the power and glory of the medieval church. Look how it's designed. Its tall, vertical decorations draw the eye upward towards heaven. Indeed, the medieval church was the most powerful institution in Europe at the time, and these constructions helped create medieval cities. Imagine what it would have been like coming from the feudal countryside to an urban center like Paris and finding a construction like this. It's built entirely in stone, and its technology had to be worked out generation by generation.
And the church's dominance of society also expressed itself in the world of art.
In the early medieval world, most of the art that was produced in monasteries on illuminated manuscripts. And most of the artists, in fact, were manuscript illustrators.
Well, that period which we understand as the late medieval and early Renaissance period is that time when artists began to rely more and more on motifs from the ancient classical world. Specifically, they were concerned with how objects were distributed in space and moved through space. So essentially what one is seeing is a move from a God's eye view of the world to a man's view of the world.
The anonymous painters and sculptors of those days were concerned almost exclusively with religious themes. Their aim was simply to use time-honored techniques to produce images that would communicate a spiritual message. The representation of reality in the ordinary, temporal world was not their intention. But art and artists were about to change forever, and the late medieval world would see the development of new ideas and techniques that would lead on to the glory of the 16th century High Renaissance and art as we know it today.
This is the medieval city of Florence, in the center of the Italian peninsula, with Rome to the south and Milan to the north. Now, Italy in the 1300s was a collection of individual city-states, and there were two types of them. One type, the Ghibelline, such as Milan and Siena, took their charter from the Holy Roman Emperor, and in essence, they were a feudal society where power was vested in the king. The other type of city, such as Florence, took its charter directly from the Pope, and in this sense, the Pope was happy to collect his money for the charter and leave the people to rule themselves as they saw fit.
Gradually, secular thinking, emphasizing the importance of trade, commerce, and an economy based on money, began to be established. In England and Northwest Europe, wool and textiles were a substantial source of new wealth. While in Italy, with its historic trade links to the east, merchants, tradesmen, and bankers began to ply increasingly profitable trade in urban centers such as Padua, Siena, and Florence. It was against this new, secular background that the great artists of the late medieval world would achieve their greatest results.
Another tradition, however, was about to be started here in Florence by their master, Giotto. And the way he was to conceive of painting was to change the history of painting for the next 500 years.
Born near Florence around 1267, little is known of Giotto's early life, like so many artists of his time. But between 1302 and 1305, we know he was working in the northern Italian town of Padua, painting the walls of the Cappella d'Arena, using a technique virtually unknown since ancient times.
In effect, he put away line as a way of making painting and started to use patches of tone. This way of working had hardly been exploited since Roman times. In effect, you could make an image with rough areas, rough patches of tones, and by varying them, create much deeper illusions of space.
Giotto rediscovered the fresco, the method of painting with watercolors on plaster while the plaster is still wet.
Fresco is an extremely durable form of painting, but it is very laborious. You start with a ground of rough mortar known as arricciato, and when that is dry, you lay on that a much more smooth and expensive plaster layer called the intonaco, which is made of ordinary gypsum and also ground marble. The key thing is that whilst this intonaco is wet, the design is painted on. The thing to remember with fresco is that because you have to paint on a wet plaster surface on the intonaco, it has to be done quickly. Therefore, as a master, Giotto would have to have been extremely decisive and deft in the way he wielded the brush.
More remarkable than Giotto's rediscovery of the fresco technique, however, were the images he created using it. But it wasn't the subject matter that made works such as The Mourning of Christ revolutionary. Visual depictions of events surrounding the life of Christ were commonplace. But the illustrations of biblical events that were created, mainly for manuscripts, were simply a means of communicating sacred themes to a mainly illiterate world. This 12th century German manuscript illustration of the Annunciation, for example, makes no attempt to represent the Virgin or the angel as physically real figures existing in real space. The artist would simply not have been concerned with this. What was remarkable about Giotto's equally religious work was that it had spatial depth.
The Lamentation of Christ, perhaps one of the best known of Giotto's fresco scenes, is one of 57 that was painted to the order of Enrico Scrovegni, a wealthy merchant of Padua. He guides us to the principal subject of the scene, namely the dead Christ, by the gazes and the gestures of the figures. The sky is treated in the typically Giottesque way, no clouds, and perhaps that lends emphasis to the scene below. That means that our gaze is almost inevitably directed to the principal subject. By the arrangement of the figures and their gestures, the eye takes in the subject all at once and focuses straight away on the principal subject, which is, in this case, the dead Christ.
While there are many aspects of Giotto's painting which remain medieval, for example in the landscape of this painting, the Lamentation, notice how the figures are fully in the round, how daring it is, as it were, to allow the ladies in the lower left to turn their backs to the surface of the painting.
Giotto's frescoes in Padua, and later works such as his fresco series for the Church of Santa Croce in Florence, are now considered to form the starting point of modern Western art. Giotto's work also made him famous. The great writer Dante described him as the greatest artist of his day.
The importance of an artist such as Giotto could be very useful to the patron because the artist was able to bring prestige to the patron, and this can be seen in Giotto's work for the Arena Chapel in Padua.
Giotto's fame spread throughout Italy, and so did his new discoveries. In the Tuscan hilltop town of Siena, a near neighbor but great rival of Florence, the influence of Giotto made itself felt.
These two cities also competed in another art form, that of painting. Now, painting did not really come from Northern Europe. It was essentially an art form that came from the Byzantine tradition of Greece. Here, there was a long tradition of icon painting, in which beautiful linear figures were drawn against a reflective gold background that sparkled in the light. These icon paintings, which were usually done on panels of wood with egg temper painted over them, were jewel-like masterpieces that formed the center of the interior of the Italian church.
This can be seen in the Annunciation, now on display in the Uffizi Gallery, Florence. We are once again presented with the biblical story of the visitation by the Archangel Gabriel to the Virgin Mary.
The Annunciation, which was by far his most famous painting, takes ideas which in some sense appear rather archaic, but when one looks at it as opposed to the earlier work, can show how he's injected quite a sense of naturalism into some of the images. Within Martini's work, we can see that he uses an extremely elegant, sinuous line in his painting, and that's expressed very sophisticatedly within the two figures. The way he treats the line when he paints the figure of Gabriel is very much more flowing, very much more sensuous than the way he treats the line when he paints the Virgin, because he wants to create this atmosphere that she's in some way rather frightened about this sudden apparition. And so he makes the figure of the angel very much more relaxed and calm.
Due to the elaborate frame, however, we must look through a series of wooden columns that stand forward of the painting, and this creates a very interesting and dynamic space. The Immaculate Conception was, as it were, a shift between heavenly space and earthly space, and in this painting, the frame has a spatial role that reiterates and repeats this shift of heavenly and earthly spaces. We move, as it were, into an intermediate space where heaven and earth touch for that miraculous moment.
Although paintings such as the Annunciation, together with Giotto's earlier work, represented a genuine step forward in the artistic representation of depth and space, such 14th century images still strike us as unsophisticated in comparison to the great masterpieces of later times. The problem was that the ability to authentically reproduce three-dimensional scenes on a two-dimensional surface had not yet been discovered. It would be the 15th century before it was. In the mid-1300s, however, the Italian artists could be excused for not concerning themselves with this art technique.
The first half of the 1300s was a period in which Florence and Siena, Martini and Giotto competed with each other. This period, however, was brought to a catastrophic end. First, there was a famine, then there was a flood, and worst of all, the plague came in two different forms. Indeed, in some of the small towns around Florence here, up to 80% of the population died. It marked a drastic period of change in Italian city-states. In effect, there was a return to a more conservative Gothic style in painting. And the Renaissance properly, the early Renaissance, didn't get going until 1400.
The beginning of the 15th century saw Florence preeminent amongst the northern Italian city-states. In economic terms, the city flourished. Its economic success was symbolized by the golden florin, the most highly regarded currency in Europe. It was truly a golden age, and within this environment of prosperity, men began to think back to a previous golden age, the glorious days of ancient Rome and Greece, much of whose knowledge had been maintained by the Arabs as Europe languished in the Dark Ages.
Florence was a hotbed of activity in the 15th century. It so happened that the Medici family, who were merchants and bankers, as well as bringing a huge amount of wealth to Florence through their fiscal activities, were also very interested in learning. They were interested in what was called humanism, and part of humanism was to develop an interest in the work of antiquity, particularly a new discovery of Latin texts by writers such as Cicero and Plato.
The 14th century in Florence saw the gradual emergence of a new building in the heart of the city, the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore.
Now, by the beginning of the 1400s, the builders of the Cathedral of Florence were in a bit of a difficult spot. They'd finished the bulk of the cathedral and left an opening at the crossing of the church that was so large no technology was available to build a dome to fill such a large space.
They were keen for the cathedral to be topped with a great dome. But no architect of the age possessed the technical skills to carry out this task. until Filippo Brunelleschi. Trained as a goldsmith, he became a master architect. In addition to mastering Gothic architectural techniques, he also studied passionately the structures and techniques of the ancient Romans.
He was a close friend of Donatello, and they went on a very important trip to Rome at this time. He noticed some of the Roman buildings that had fallen down, and they had domes of a sort. But he noticed that unlike the Gothic arch, there was no keystone at the top of a Roman dome. He began to look more closely, and he discovered that instead of building tall vertical ribs that locked at the top, that the buildings built by the Romans were in effect built as a series of smaller and smaller donuts. Of course, the Romans had a substance called concrete. The formula at this time had been lost. But Brunelleschi figured out a way of laying bricks in a herringbone pattern that interlocked so that the dome could be built in a series of self-supporting rings. No wooden frame was necessary. In effect, Brunelleschi mixed the Gothic system of ribs, which you can still see in the dome, and the circular system of building that he got from the Romans. Together, he was able to make a twin-walled system that allowed him to build what still remains today the second largest masonry dome in the world.
Brunelleschi's achievement in creating the cathedral dome remains his most enduring achievement in architecture, and one still appreciated by thousands of people who visit Florence every year. But other buildings designed by Brunelleschi, such as the Foundling Hospital, also in Florence, display the genius of a man who, while inspired by the classical world and passionate about their techniques, sought to create a new architecture for the new age of prosperity that he lived in.
In this building, he used a rigorous system of proportions that he derived from classical architecture. The height of the columns is equal to the distance between the columns, and the same dimension is used again on the depth of the bay. This part of the bay is based upon a cube, and above this he's placed a sphere that is cut on top of it and is the same size. This system of proportions, based on 1:2, 1:5, and 2:5, is used throughout the whole building. This sense of balance and proportion was something that wasn't used in Gothic architecture. In addition, the whole city square here is unified by the same architecture. In other words, this is the first large-scale modern urban design in 1,000 years.
As we have seen, 14th century artists such as Giotto and Martini attempted to introduce depth into their paintings, a significant step towards the notion of painting as a reflection of reality, rather than the simple message of spirituality. The artists of classical times had also attempted to solve the problems of representing three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface, but with limited success. They were unable to formulate a consistent mathematical system to achieve this. But it was the genius of Brunelleschi that finally solved the problem, and in the process changed painting forever. In the years before his work on Florence Cathedral Dome, Brunelleschi discovered the laws of perspective.
Brunelleschi, as an architect, had devised what was the first abstract mathematical way of rendering spatial recession. Almost certainly what we would call the centric point system, where you set a vanishing point on a surface, draw the horizon, set out the orthogonal lines, and your design is disciplined by that.
The discovery of the laws of perspective represented a revolution in visual art. And the first artist to take advantage of the new knowledge was Masaccio. A Florentine like Brunelleschi, and likewise originally trained as a goldsmith, Masaccio created no more than a handful of works in his lifetime.
Masaccio, although he did have a short career, has a very significant impact on artists who were to work after him. In his Holy Trinity, which still remains in Santa Maria Novella in Florence, you can see how Masaccio has begun to apply the mathematical rules of perspective to create an illusion of space. And the illusion of space creates a dramatic impact and adds emphasis to the story which he's concerned with depicting.
The Masaccio Trinity, it's in Santa Maria Novella, the church in Florence. And it's in fact painted on the side wall of the nave of the church. It's a fresco. It's an image which purports to be like a small side chapel. He began to study the effects of perspective, and he began to learn perspective from his friend who was the architect Brunelleschi. And what he wanted to do when he painted the Trinity was to create this impression that one looked into a small side chapel, and there the Trinity is the event that's happening within the side chapel. And because of that, what he wanted to do was to make it as though the side chapel was a part of the building itself. So the idea of creating the perspective was to make the sense that space was continuous into the image. For this, he created a thing which was known as one-point perspective, where all of the vanishing lines converge to one vanishing point in the painting. And when we see early perspective paintings, most of them are of this type, this one-point perspective.
It's difficult to overstate the significance of Masaccio's work to the development of Western painting. Frescoes such as the Holy Trinity and the Tribute Money, with its dramatic positioning of Christ's head relative to the perspectival lines of the buildings, caused a sensation, because nothing like this had ever been seen before. Tragically, Masaccio was unable to enjoy the rewards of his artistic achievements. He died in 1428 at the age of 27. The system of perspective he used would live on, however, and would be formalized in 1436 by Leon Alberti in his book On Painting, which would become the standard textbook on perspective for generations. An architect perhaps best known for the facade of Santa Maria Novella in Florence. Alberti's abilities extended far beyond art theory and architecture. A musician, a poet, and a philosopher, well-versed in science, politics, and the knowledge of the ancients, Alberti was truly one of the leading lights in Florence of the first half of the 15th century. We might be tempted to use the phrase Renaissance man to describe a man of such learning and ability, and rightly so. The artistic and intellectual melting pot that was Florence in those decades is now considered to be the period of the early Renaissance, when artists and intellectuals consciously sought the rebirth of great artistic achievement after the long period since the decline of ancient Rome. Our notion of the Middle Ages as the period between the two great flowerings of human civilization stems from this period. It was truly a remarkable age, with groundbreaking developments in all the visual arts. In architecture and painting, as we have seen, but also in sculpture, with the work of one Donato di Niccolo di Betto Bardi, better known to history as Donatello. The third in the great Florentine triumvirate of the early Renaissance, alongside Brunelleschi and Masaccio, and widely considered to be the greatest artist of his century, Donatello was, like so many of his contemporaries, trained as a goldsmith, but quickly discovered his true artistic calling. In keeping with the prevailing artistic thinking, he was fascinated by the works of classical times. As a sculptor, this was not surprising. The works of the Roman sculptors were amongst the greatest achievements of the classical world, displaying an understanding of human anatomy that Donatello sought to regain with his own detailed studies of the human form. But like his contemporaries, Donatello was not concerned with simply copying the works of the ancients. He sought to combine the skills of the past with the humanistic spirit of his own age, and succeeded magnificently. One of Donatello's earlier works, a marble statue of St. George, which was made for the facade of Florence's Or San Michele, demonstrates his ability.
Donatello has turned his image of St. George into a symbol of the model citizen, the regular local boy who's been called upon to do great things in an unexpected situation. When you look at his face, you can see that he looks rather unsure, somewhat anxious and nervous. And yet when the opportunity arises, although he doesn't seem to be heroic, in fact he turns out to be. While completely reworking the freestanding figure, Donatello also did something else incredible. He reinvented the low-relief carving. Below the St. George, we can see a shallow panel that shows George killing the dragon. Here, he's taken up Giotto's technique of making pictures by modulating tonal areas and turned this into a way of working in low relief. In other words, he simply carves a section to create a dark patch. And in this way, by modulating the lights and the darks, he can create a deep spatial picture. No one ever, not even the Romans, learned to carve low-relief panels in this way. It gave low-relief carving a pictorial power that it had never had before.
While Florence experienced the dramatic new ideas and works of the early Renaissance, across the Alps in northwestern Europe, artists were slower to cast off the traditions of the past. The period around the turn of the 15th century was dominated by what became known as the International Gothic style, an intensely decorative style with a strong emphasis on line, as can be seen in the National Gallery's Wilton diptych, a late 14th century tempera work. Though the name of the creator is now lost, the person responsible for the production of the work is known, for he is depicted in it. It is that tragic monarch, Richard II of England, who is kneeling before Mary and Jesus. The Wilton diptych is what is known as a donor portrait. Donor portraits, in which a patron's image would be incorporated into a painting of a biblical or mythological scene, were extremely popular in late medieval times, and would continue to be commissioned across Europe well into the Renaissance.
In the latter part of the 1300s and the beginning of the 1400s, Gothic architecture and art became an international style, as we can see here in Amsterdam's New Church.
The international Gothic style of paintings, such as the Wilton diptych, was not an artistic school in the modern sense of the phrase. Rather a similarity of style that achieved popularity across Europe, especially among the artists of the Netherlands. It was artists from this part of Europe who would produce a large quantity of the important artworks produced away from Italy in the late medieval period. Although tragically, much of the art of the Low Countries would be destroyed in the religious conflicts and disputes that would later afflict the region.
The Limburg brothers, from here in Holland, became part of this international movement.
The Limburg brothers were important artists who were working within the circle of the Duke of Burgundy. The Duke of Burgundy was a religious man. Prayer was a very important part of his life, and he had what was called a Book of Hours. The Tréricheur was the name of the Book of Hours, which was decorated by the Limburg brothers and provided an excellent opportunity for them to really take their work with miniature painting and illuminated manuscripts to its full potential. They were able to experiment with new pigments, new designs, which religious subject matter and the theme of prayer allowed them to do.
It is one of the finest examples of the international Gothic style, in that you have very rich colour, especially of costume, but also very interestingly there is some new realism coming in. The individual motifs of landscape, of trees, plants, animals, this sort of thing are shown as we would understand it naturalistically and realistically. There is also an attempt at spatial recession by the use of plane surfaces, a curving path or a curving river, perhaps a castle wall shown on the diagonal, and also very often, certainly in the one which depicts the month of October, where the chateau is shown in what we would call bifocal perspective, where the walls are receding away at an angle from the viewer. So in that sense, they show some of the newer art. But of course, it's not the same as that which is being practiced in Italy, or would be practiced in Italy, in the early part of the 15th century, because there is no unified perspective system. Again, the eye is still allowed to wander over the richness of the motifs and the colours, instead of being focused on one principal subject or one principal point in the composition.
And although the ideas of the Italian masters began to spread throughout Europe, the art of the Netherlands retained its own individual identity, with its greatest master undoubtedly Jan van Eyck. Like many artists of his age, little is known of the early life of Van Eyck, and even less of his brother Hubert, who is believed to have been involved with the creation of some of his early work. By 1425, however, we know that he was established in Lille as a court painter to Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, a relationship that would make Jan van Eyck a wealthy man. By 1432, he had completed what many considered to be his greatest work, an altarpiece for the Cathedral of St. Bavo in Ghent, which Hubert almost certainly helped to create. As with the earlier work of the Limbourg brothers, the new system of perspective is absent. And yet the Ghent altarpiece achieves an impression of 3 dimensions, with its immaculate detail and tonal contrasts, both in the individual figures and in the landscape, to create an effect quite unlike any contemporary work in Italy. And another innovative aspect of the Ghent altarpiece is the material which Jan van Eyck chose to execute the work. For Van Eyck was the pioneer in the use of a new kind of painting, oil painting.
Van Eyck was in fact considered to be the founder, or the person who invented the technique of oil painting, though in fact it was probably invented by a number of artists at the time. But what oil paint allows the painter to do is to produce extremely realistic, almost photographically realistic images.
He is best known for his treatment and handling of light. He achieved this by the use of several hard resin oil glazes laid usually, though not always, on a ground colour or dead colour of tempera. It was these glazes which gave his work that intense luminosity which so characterises the Flemish School of Art, and which was regarded by the Italians when they saw some of his work as almost a miracle.
With the new flexibility of oil paints, Van Eyck produced a body of work that would earn him fame in his own country as the king of painters. One of his best-known works is the Virgin of Chancellor Roland, part of the collection of the Louvre in Paris. The Madonna and Holy Child are seated beside a kneeling Nicholas Roland, Philip the Good's chancellor, in another fine example of a donor portrait, with the background landscape providing a marvelous illustration of the detail with which Jan van Eyck executed his masterpieces. Significantly, Van Eyck was also commissioned to produce work without any religious dimension whatsoever. He was a portraitist of the highest order, the first great master of the genre in the post-medieval era. And although much of his work has been lost, including all his commissions for Philip the Good, his 1434 portrait, which apparently depicts the marriage of a wealthy Italian merchant, Giovanni Arnolfini, to his new bride, has survived. Apparently, although some analysts believe the two figures to be Jan van Eyck himself and his wife, whoever the man and woman depicted actually were, the betrothal of the Arnolfini, now on display in London's National Gallery, triumphantly asserts Jan van Eyck's abilities.
In the case of the Arnolfini marriage, what we are witnessing is what could be described without exaggeration as a catalogue of textures, from the wood of the floorboards of the bedroom to the richness of the fabrics and the transparency of the glass and the hard adamantine sheen of the mirror. The painting is essentially an allegory of marriage as well as a depiction of it. Almost certainly, Jan van Eyck is painting what he actually witnessed. The inscription over the mirror in Latin, Johannes de Eyck fuit hic, Jan van Eyck was here, and the date 1434. And if we look in the mirror, we can see two tiny reflected figures in it, as well as the Arnulfines, so perhaps he was one of the witnesses. It is full of symbols of the allegory of the sanctity of marriage. The fruit on the windowsill signifies the innocence of man before the fall. The single candle burning in the chandelier signifies both the all-seeing eye of Christ and also the sanctity of the marriage oath. It's not a large work. It's the sheer density of motifs which would certainly show it's a typically northern work, and of course it has all the magnificence of Van Eyck's oil painting technique with the translucent glazes, which not only give a wonderful depth of colour, but which are also extremely durable. The painting has survived to the present day with virtually no restoration work done.
Although secular themes would become increasingly important to the artists of Northern Europe, work inspired by religion continued to be widespread, as can be seen in the work of the other great figure of the 15th century Netherlands art, Roger van der Weyden, a contemporary of Van Eyck, who became the official painter to the city of Bruges in 1435. Christian themes dominated his life's work, especially images of the Virgin Mary and the crucifixion. The descent from the cross is typical and shows van der Weyden, like Van Eyck, using great detail, but arranging the figures around Christ in confined space, producing a strong spiritual impression. Though it's known that van der Weyden produced a number of secular works in his lifetime, including now-lost erotic nudes, his religious masterpieces have secured him a place in European art history. For all their genius, 15th century Netherlands artists such as Van Eyck and van der Weyden were still working within an older tradition, and one which would be continued by subsequent figures such as Hugo van der Goes and Dirk Bouts, whose altarpiece for the Church of St. Peter in Louvain actually shows the donors in contemporary dress at the Last Supper, linking the real world with the divine world. Although the new thinking in Italy was known to some Northern European artists at the time, it would be later before mathematical perspective and the other discoveries made by Brunelleschi, Masaccio, and the Florentine greats of the early 15th century would make themselves fully felt north of the Alps. Back in Italy, however, the new thinking was being applied with gusto, and the Italian art of the later 15th century was a time of almost unrivaled innovation and experiment, laying the ground for the wonders of the century to come. Unsurprisingly, artists from Florence were heavily involved with a new culture of experiment and discovery, and for the Florentine Paolo Uccello, a craftsman obsessed with geometry, the new ideas of mathematical perspective were massively significant.
In the 15th century, artists who were working north of the Alps were interested in design. They were interested in flat patterns, and they weren't interested in a realistic depiction of space, whereas artists working in Italy were beginning to be interested in a more naturalistic representation of form, of space. So they were starting to move away from a focus on aspects of decoration, aspects of design, which could detract from a more lifelike representation of nature.
Elsewhere in Italy, the ideas that influenced Uccello were manifesting themselves. From Padua came Andrea Mantegna, a true great of 15th century Italian art. In his early frescoes, his use of perspective is obvious, but it is the form of the human figures that is most striking. As solid as Donatello's sculptures, which influenced him greatly, their spatial distribution lends the whole scene an air of realism and drama. Mantegna's mastery of what might be termed an architectural approach to space can be also seen with his altarpiece, The Madonna Enthroned, where he uses the frame columns as an integral part of the spatial definition of the three panels, whose force is amplified by the artist's use of natural light to illuminate the altarpiece by means of a window specially cut in the choir wall. The importance of space and light in painting was also recognized by another Italian, Piero della Francesca, who in true Renaissance style wrote books on the geometry and perspective that interested him so much. Like Mantegna, his greatest works were frescoes, created for the church of San Francesco in Arezzo. If we take the fresco from this series that depicts the legendary dream of the Emperor Constantine, his vision of the cross which led to his conversion to Christianity, we see that not only has Piero incorporated the theories of perspective, but has dramatically made use of light to create the illusion of depth. The sense of distance between the pike-carrying soldier and the opening to the tent, bathed as it is in light, is striking, and Piero's innovations made possible the development of night scenes in painting. For all the artistic developments going on across Italy as the 15th century neared its end, Florence remained the center of artistic excellence. And it was Florence that produced the last great Italian painter of the 15th century, Sandro Botticelli.
In a way, Botticelli was like any other Renaissance man. He had to negotiate two worlds, both the Christian and the recently discovered classical world. For example, in this painting, we can see the long, linear treatment of the human form, particularly in the Virgin Mary in the center. Yet around the Virgin Mary, we see the 12 apostles receiving the Holy Spirit at the moment of Pentecost. Their faces and hands show many traces of Botticelli's knowledge of classical sculpture. Botticelli, in the end, renounced his classical tradition and burned many of these paintings. Fortunately, this is one which deals with a Christian subject that has survived this change of heart.
In many ways, the achievements of Botticelli are more subtle than other masters of the century, although in one of his earlier works, we can identify a significant technical development. The illusion of a central pyramid as the defining focus of the painting, a technique which would be widely adopted by the generations that followed him. But when we consider what is undoubtedly Botticelli's best-known work, The Birth of Venus, in the Uffizi Gallery in his home city, it almost seems as if the innovations of the century concerned with perspective, proportion, and anatomy had passed him by. But his aims, with The Birth of Venus, were more concerned with art than with science, and the enduring popularity of this work is testimony to his achievement.
Birth of Venus was painted around about 1485 by Sandro Botticelli. Botticelli, in fact, rather rejected the rather austere Renaissance ideas that artists like Masaccio wanted to develop for a rather more linear style of painting. And the painting itself depicts Venus arriving at the shore of Cyprus. When we see her, we might think that this perhaps is a bright, sunny morning, but what we actually see in the painting is that it's rather a cold, grey morning, and perhaps her birth wasn't quite the auspicious event that one would imagine it to be.
It is a rather elegant rendering of what is a rather a grim legend in classical history, where Saturn tore off the testicles of Kronos, Uranus' father, and hurled them into the sea, and the sea erupted into foam, and Venus arose from that foam, hence her Greek name of Aphrodite, which means risen from the sea, and the Latin Venus, and Greco-Latin name of Venus Anadyomene, which means risen from the sea.
Botticelli himself, as a painter, depicted these images for commission purposes. He was commissioned by a wealthy patron who was Lorenzo di Pier Francesco de' Medici, And The Birth of Venus is one of a number of paintings, such as the Primavera and Pallas and the Centaur, all of which have the same sorts of imagery, where we see very elegantly drawn women, sometimes slightly scantily clad, which come as quite a new departure, and it shows how far Renaissance ideas had developed, that these kind of images could become acceptable.
It's significant that Botticelli's friend was the sculptor and painter Andrea del Verrocchio, whose magnificent statue of the Florentine general Coleoni can still be seen in Venice today.
Florentine artists at the end of the 1400s made a greater study of human anatomy, and they also became interested in trying to show animals and figures in motion. And for this reason, the Coleoni monument is a wonderful example. In fact, this is only the second bronze equestrian monument in over 1,000 years. The first was made by Donatello, who of course reworked and reinvented almost every sculptural tradition available. Donatello's monument, however, was much more static. All four hooves of the horse were on the ground. Here we can see Verrocchio is bringing in his interest in movement and making a more dynamic monument. He's accomplished the tremendous technical feat of balancing this enormous weight of metal on the three legs of the horse so that he can show the battle charger in mid-stride. Likewise, Coleoni is shown in movement. His chest is twisted one way, his head twisted the other. This dynamism gives Coleoni a sense of psychological impact. There's a fury and determination in his face that combines both anatomical understanding with psychological understanding. A good deal of the early Renaissance can be understood as a balancing between Christian and classical values. And yet here, at the end of the 1400s, we have something new arising. This is studied directly from nature, and as such, we're dealing here with something that is proto-scientific. In other words, it was Verrocchio's student, Leonardo da Vinci, at the beginning of the High Renaissance, who put aside both classical and Christian texts and literature and decided to trust nothing other than what his own investigations told him were true. Amongst other things, then, it was Verrocchio's understanding and study of nature and his love of portraying complex psychological states of mind that opened up the doors for the High Renaissance.